CHAPTER IX of the Giant Killer, or the Battle which all must fight, by Charlotte Maria Tucker. Recording in the public domain. Lynne Thompson. Chapter 9. Fair Gratitude. From that day the children of the Roby family firmly and prayerfully resolved to struggle against the enemy within, and, if possible, by benefits, overcome those whom they regarded as the enemy without. Instead of exciting each other to anger by complaints of annoyance from the Probyns, they agreed to unite all their powers to render their difficult duty more easy. If gloom gathered on Bertha's brow at some unreasonable request from Adolphus, the smile of Aleck reminded her of the victory over the giant. If her brother flushed in an insolent word from Constantine, he caught the quiet glance of Bertha's eye, and was silent. Where the darts of bitter words are broken and thrown aside, passion usually dies away. Aleck and Bertha both endeavoured to keep a bridle on their lips, and their efforts were not all in vain. Constantine, who had some generosity in his nature, grew ashamed of offering provocation where none was returned; and Mrs. Roby, with a delight which few but a parent can fully understand, watched the growing improvement in her children. Their patience, their forbearance, were increasing under trial, their virtues were becoming strengthened by practice. They knew more of the difficulties of the Christian fight, but they also knew more of the spirit which overcomes them. The Probyns also were not exactly the same as when they had first been received into Dove's Nest. It is true that we do not uproot in a few weeks the weeds that have been suffered to spread for years, that habits of order, obedience, and self–denial are usually of slow growth, because not natural to the human heart. Yet some improvement might be seen, though small, to encourage hope for the future. Adolphus and Constantine had been not as those who fall into the pit of selfishness, but as those who are born and brought up in its depths. The pleasure of thinking of others, living for others, giving up their own will for the happiness of others, had been as unknown to these boys as the brightness of the sky and the beauties of nature would be to one who had always dwelt underground. They now began to have an idea that we are born for something more than merely to eat and drink and amuse ourselves, and, with the example of the Robys before him, Constantine felt sometimes half inclined to lay hold, like Fides, on the twigs of love of approbation, and win praise by showing a little kindness. His motives, however, were too weak, his selfishness too strong, for him yet to make much progress, and his pride was ever in his way. Adolphus, on his part, was certainly more upon his guard against the enemy Untruth. He had little need to search for him behind the mask, for hypocrisy was not in his disposition, but equivocation, usually the result of fear, had become, alas, but too familiar to the boy; while, until he became the pupil of Mr. Roby, Adolphus had scarcely ever related an occurrence without falling into the error of exaggeration. "There are hundreds of sheep in that meadow," he exclaimed one day. "Hundreds! It scarcely appears so to me," was Mr. Roby's quiet reply. "Will you oblige me by counting the exact number?" Adolphus, a little annoyed, had to comply. There were not more than 40 in the field. "Then, taking your statement at the lowest, your hundreds but at 200," said the clergyman, "by how much has the glass of exaggeration multiplied the number of the sheep?" "Oh, I am not half so slow as you think me," cried Adolphus at another time, when some observation had been made about learning. "I can get 20 stanzas by heart before breakfast." "Have you ever tried to do so?" inquired Mr. Roby. "Oh, I've done it 50 times," cried the boy. "If you have done it 50 times, you will easily do it 51," said Mr. Roby. "I shall expect you to bring the stanzas to–morrow morning. and he rose from his seat to take down a volume of poetry from the bookcase. The countenance of Adolphus fell. He was ashamed of his silly boasting, and afraid of the consequences which it might bring upon him. He had no alternative but that of either confessing that he had spoken nonsense, or studying hard till noon before breakfast could be touched. So, mortifying as it was, he chose the former course, and was far more guarded in his speech in future. Several interruptions had occurred to postpone the reading of The Giant–killer, but one noon, the little party being assembled around her, Mrs. Roby continued as follows: FAIR GRATITUDE. The life of Fides was not one of rest. He well knew that fresh labours were before him, but his was a joyous, gladsome heart. He felt honoured by the permission to serve his king, and to devote his strength to the cause that he loved. One autumn evening, when the red orb of the sun was setting behind a bank of clouds, tipping their edges with golden light, as Fides was passing along the side of the morass of Forgetfulness, he thought that he heard a faint cry. He paused to listen, for by a champion of the truth the voice of distress is never heard in vain. Wide and dreary the swamp lay before him. Not a tree broke the dismal expanse, but rank weeds grew thick in many parts, with rushes that seemed bending beneath the white mist that spread like a pall over the morass. Their presence betokened that of water, but no silvery sheet reflected the fading splendour of the setting sun. The mantling green upon the pools shut out the light, and filled the air with unwholesome odours. Remembrance of the past may be painful, when we review our mistakes and recollect our errors, but better, far better, to wander even over the painful desert of regret, than to lose sense of both pleasure and sorrow together in the fatal morass of forgetfulness. Again that cry, even more faint than before, but Fides felt certain that he heard one. As his sight could scarcely pierce the gathering mist, he lifted up his voice and shouted. From the swamp an answer was returned, as from the voice of a woman in distress. "Help! Help!" it cried, "for I am sinking. In the slough of forgetfulness I shall be lost." Fides hesitated for a moment, then his resolution was taken. Whatever might betide him in the attempt, he must venture to the rescue of the sinking sufferer. With a light and springing step he bounded forward some little distance in safety, and could now see, not far from where he stood, the form of a woman struggling in the swamp. But between her and him lay a part of the morass too soft to be traversed securely, though the ground upon which the knight rested his foot was firm. Then a thought came to the mind of Fides, and he instantly acted upon it. The long cord of twisted silk and gold, by which he had climbed from the pit of selfishness, he had borne along with him ever since, wound in many a fold round his form. He speedily unrolled it, and grasping one end, he fastened his shield to the other, and then flung the buckler, with a strong arm and a steady aim, in the direction of the sinking woman. She touched it, grasped it, laid hold upon it, and as one who, when drowning, clings for life, and by means of the soft bright cord of love, Fides gradually drew her to firmer ground, where the trembling one might rest in safety. As she thanked him fervently again and again, the earnestness of her manner giving force to her words, her voice tremulous with emotion as she spoke, Fides thought that a being more exquisitely lovely his eyes had never beheld. The angel sweetness of her face told of a spirit pure, loving, and holy. Every movement was full of grace, and it was no marvel that the world, enchanted with her beauty, had surnamed her Gratitude the Fair. "Gentle maiden," said Fides, "by what strange misadventure hast thou fallen into yon dangerous swamp?" "I was flying from my enemy, the stern giant Pride, from him who seeks to destroy me. The very name of gratitude is hateful to his spirit. He would slay me if he could. or if not, drive me forth to dwell among savages or the beasts of the field. Even with bears, with lions, I would be safer far than with him. He tracked me this evening as, hard by this place, I bore home a large basketful of benefits, which I had been gathering in order to preserve. The instant that Pride saw me, he pursued me. I dropped my burden in the haste of my flight. And though I fled yonder, where he dared not follow, I beheld him with insolent scorn scatter my fruit over the waters of the morass. I fear to meet him now on my homeward way. I shall perish by his cruelty at last." "Fear not, fair Gratitude," replied Fides. "This sword shall be drawn in thy defence. Sooner will I die than suffer thee to be destroyed, thou that art beloved of all the children of virtue. Let me escort thee now to thy home. Then, without delay, will I seek out that giant who would sink Gratitude in forgetfulness." So Gratitude led Fides towards her dwelling, and much they discoursed by the way of the giant who was now to be overcome. "Pride is a prince amongst the giants," said the maiden. "Not one has greater power than he. He is also one of the most artful of thy foes. He can often assume the manner and garb of a citizen of the land, and he can speak its language in a way to deceive even an experienced ear." "How then shall I know him?" asked Fides. "He speaks the language well," replied the maiden, "but yet is unacquainted with the character in which it is written. This Pride has never learnt, and by this thou mayst easily detect him. But there is a friend of mine, named Experience, who dwells not very far from this place. When thou hast passed over the hill to our right, the sound of his hammer on the anvil will be thy sure guide to his forge. From him thou mayst gain knowledge more than I can give. He will direct thee to the haunts of the giant. He will also tell thee of a marvellous and precious thing, which once belonged to the treasury of thy king, but was stolen thence by the giant. A high and glorious reward has been offered to him who will restore to its rightful owner the golden staff of the will. Mayst thou have strength to wrest it from Pride, and may I be granted strength to free thee from thy persecutor." "Thou hast already slain one foe to me and mine," replied fair Gratitude. "I was long an object of the hate of Giant Selfishness, since I helped to fix by his fatal pit that cord of love with which thou hast since saved me. Once I myself almost stifled in the pit, but Experience came to my succor." "I have often heard of thy name, fair Gratitude," said Fides, "but I never beheld thee before." "I have been much talked of in the world, but little known," she replied. "Thousands have eagerly promised to make me their companion till death, but on their way to my home have turned back, or been lost in the morass of forgetfulness." By this time the maiden and the knight had reached the dwelling of Gratitude. A small, humble abode it appeared, with a doorway so low that Fides had to stoop his plumed helmet ere he could enter. But no sooner was he within the place than he gazed with admiration around. He found himself in a goodly dwelling, lighted by a beautiful silver lamp, which cast soft radiance like moonlight, and in diamond letters glittered the word Memory, inlaid in the clear metal. It was the daily occupation of fair Gratitude to keep this lamp perfectly bright. With her own hand she fed it with precious oils, which shed a delicious perfume through the place. By the mild light of Memory, Fides beheld that the room in which he stood was hung round with exquisite pictures, all of which represented scenes beautiful to the eye and pleasing to the heart. In one a mother was tenderly bending over the cradle of a helpless babe. In another, a father, with the best of books open before him, was instructing a fair–haired child. One picture showed a poor widow receiving aid from a generous friend. The next, a truant led back by an elder companion to the path which he had lost, half struggling, half resisting, and yet clinging to the guide, whose looks told of pity and love. An open door led into an inner apartment, even fairer and more preciously adorned than the first, into which fair Gratitude often retired for the purpose of prayer and praise, for this was her dearest occupation, this was her highest delight. After Fides had passed a short space of time in examining the pictures hung round the walls, and had received from Gratitude minute directions as to the way to the dwelling of Experience, who could guide him to the haunts of Giant Pride, he took his leave of the gentle maiden. She stood at the doorway to see him depart on his dangerous but glorious mission, and there, as she lingered, with the faint moonbeams gleaming on her lovely form, her clasped hands, and her soft flowing hair, Fides thought that she looked like an angel of light blessing him before the battle. Still, as he pursued his onward way, he could fancy that he beheld fair Gratitude yet, trimming and feeding her silver lamp, and gazing fondly on the pictures that reminded her so sweetly of the past. Laura had edged her little chair nearer and nearer to her mother as the description of the dwelling of Gratitude was read, and her curly head was resting on the knee of her parent at the close. The Probyns sat silent, thinking perhaps what pictures Gratitude should hang up for them. They had been accustomed to receive kindnesses with pleasure indeed, but without any idea of keeping a thankful remembrance of those to whom they were indebted for them. Pleasures, when once over, had to them left nothing behind. They had not lighted the silver lamp of memory in their hearts to renew joys and bring the past back again. They had not yet, like Aleck and Bertha, known the deep, sweet feeling of gratitude, which, beginning with duteous love towards the parents who have watched over our childhood, extends to every friend whose kindness has cheered us, and rises most noble, most holy in its nature, towards the Giver of all that is good. Where pride and selfishness hold their sway, alas! too often it is found that gratitude, a virtue despised or unknown, is lost in the swamp of forgetfulness. End of chapter 9.